Hey everyone, it's Chad,
It's Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so to start off this episode, I want to give a little recap of what we talked about in our last one. And in our last episode, we really touched on the French Revolution and the impact that it had as it led into the idea of the balance of power in the British and the Pax Britannia. So the French Revolution really created a fear of what the ideas of liberty, of personal freedom, of liberalism, that a fear that these ideas would be brought from not only from France, but would seep into the other empires, into the other regions of Europe. The fear of this, again, is that it would undermine the power of the kings. It would undermine the power of those in authority in ways unlike the world had ever seen. So, as we touched on in that last episode, leaders in Austria Hungary, in other countries of Europe, really stamped down with methods of censorship, of restricting the press, of restricting basically the freedom of ideas in order to stop this threat of liberalism. And what followed the French Revolution, of course, was the rise of Napoleon and the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. And so by 1815, which is where we're going to really begin this episode, the situation that we're in is that we have the Napoleonic Wars, that is, had just ended. And these were wars that were incredibly devastating and left a searing memory in the leaders of Europe and would do so for years to come. At least 5 million to upwards of 10 million people died within the Napoleonic Wars. And so, with the Congress of Vienna, which is what we're going to be focusing on, the leaders of each country, they really had an imperative to come to agreements, to come to solutions, to make a framework that would bring peace to Europe for the first time, really, in about 25 years. This wasn't some place where leaders should, whether they would or wouldn't would be up for the leaders themselves. This wasn't a place where leaders should be seeking to just expand their territory to make larger empires or which that whatever. These leaders had a reason. They had a reason to stop all this bloodshed, to stop the conflict, and to have a relatively stable Europe for years to come. And as we begin this episode, is where we're at with the Congress of Vienna. So with that, I'll let you start off, Khalil.
One thing that needs to be understood with the Congress of Vienna, as Chad already mentioned, but the significance of it and the importance of these leaders to come to agreements is that is that Europe had already gone through about a quarter century of war, an entire generation. The people that were fighting for France or any one of the nations in the first coalition against the French revolutionary government in the 1790s, their sons might have been fighting Napoleon again at Waterloo, or maybe at the Battle of Nations in Leipzig, or pushing Napoleon's troops out of Russia. So the length of this conflict is something that cannot be ignored, as well as the fear that it put into the leaders, the death count, as well as the inspiration for liberal ideals that it brought, not just within France as the heart of this era in European history for liberal ideals, but also to anywhere else that was affected in Europe, which is just about everywhere. So, with the Congress of Vienna, again, as Chad mentioned, there was a real importance to come to a conclusion, to resolve disputes, to create a model for which, hopefully, as the kings, the emperors, princes, queens, and high nobles would all be able to create a international order for which they would be able to exist. Because as a lot of the radical liberals and a lot of these movements suggested, they did not want a king. They didn't want an emperor, prince, queen to rule over them. They thought that their sovereignty and their identity came more from the common people rather than those people. So why have them in positions of power in the first place? So the Congress of Vienna was really a reactionary event to create a not a world because we're talking about Europe. It's a very Eurocentric event here, but a continent for which ideals would revert back to where they were before the French Revolution. So really to undo or the attempt to undo everything. So as we mentioned all throughout Peace Be Freedom, but especially at the very end, there is a difference between the pessimistic model of peacekeeping for which Britain was known for with their balance of power and America or like a a means of international authority and peacekeeping for which America would be known for, and the institutions that were around at the time of its hegemony, as which still exists now, like NATO and the UN. When America nowadays and those institutions advocate for more international law, for which there be rules by which nations operate, and if you break those rules, there are consequences for that. Saddam Hussein learned that in 1991, but or Milosevic in 1999. But before this is before that time, there was a more pessimistic model for which if you decided to disrupt the peace by trying to gain more power than you could have in this balance, then the other nations would go against you. And so there'd be incentives against aggression to really make war look stupid. So according to a one of the many books that I've read in preparation for this series, Germany, A Nation in Its Time by Helmut Walser Smith, on page 201, quote, he writes, the Congress brought about this peace by creating a balance of forces that left none of the great powers dissatisfied. Even the loser of the war, France, came to accept the fundamental legitimacy of the new order, end quote. And so, unlike the flaws of the Versailles settlement in 1919, post World War One, and where a lot of the enemies and the major warring powers against the Allies, the losers, were not part of the negotiations. Um, in this settlement at the Congress of Vienna, even France was there because there was a recognition that for the sake of peace within the continent, France, as a belligerent and as an enemy to much of Europe, needed to be rebranded and brought into this settlement as it was a major contributor to European peace. And so, unfortunately, for a lot of smaller states, because France isn't exactly a smaller state, the rights of those smaller states were secondary to protecting the peace. That's why one of the people that would be very important for this time in European history from 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and during the Congress of Vienna until 1848, another very important year in European history, something that we will talk about later in this series. That's why Metternich, Prince Metternich, that's his name, was challenged at the conference as he wanted a balance of power peace that would keep like major powers just strong enough to where they were satisfied, but not so satisfied that it provoke other neighbors, or not so weak that it will provoke other neighbors to attack them. While his emperor, Francis I, ordered him to maintain a certain rule of law for these smaller states and keep certain territorial integrities for those states and have them exist under leadership from their higher nobles and their princes, in a way that would somehow keep the balance and keep the peace of the continent, while not again predicting what any other ruler at the time would do to overstep their bounds and invade a smaller state and again bring the continent into wider war.
Yeah,
So um
yeah.
yeah,
Let me pick up on that. Yeah. So like what you have with the balance of power is that nations and empires and states would be somewhat reorganized to a level where that they would be equally as threatening to each other. Um, so let's say I have 5 tanks. Okay, Khalil has 5 tanks. Our friend down the corner, he's got 5 tanks. So we all have, a similar level of power. In reality, of course, this is going to be how much land you have, how big your armies might be, how many colonies you may have in the vicinity, or whichever these leaders would kind of come to agree upon. But it's a level of order on stability in that whichever side would want to become, say, aggressive against another side or another state, they would be fighting in equal power. Both sides would suffer the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions of casualties that were brought in the Napoleonic Wars because the wars would be even. It wouldn't be, whoever has the most whoever has the largest tanks, the most troops, the most ships, the most armies would win. It would be ideally that each sides would be so equal that you would both lose out just as bad as the other, that it doesn't seem it's not worth it to fight against another state. This draws back to another idea we talked about way back, the idea of nuclear deterrence, which we have today, and that nuclear armed states both realizing that any sort of conflict between the two would lead to such unimaginable consequences for either that they wouldn't even dare think about fighting or starting a conflict with each other. This balance of power was attempted to be something similar. I wouldn't say, the same, of course, because balance of power became earlier. Um, but it was trying to do a similar thing. If you're as equal, or if your neighbor can't do anything to really upset that balance that's keeping you guys stable, then Europe ideally would stay the way it is. And Khalil brought up a good point: is that what happens to all the little guys? The people who aren't France, who aren't Britain, who don't have who don't have all the colonies or all the armies or all the nations or all the big princes who could influence as much as they want. They kind of get thrown to the side, because if one of those smaller nations were to become as powerful, and grow to a level that could, say, threaten the balance of Europe, then what are you supposed to do about that? Is everyone supposed to join in and fight against that newer threat? Is, their neighbor nation supposed to absorb them, and then the rest of them figure out the borders going from there? And so it presents an issue that in this situation will present itself. But the idea of those smaller nations becoming more powerful is is worrisome, and it's something that upsets this kind of balance. And so it unintentionally, that is, kind of skews this balance to help those nations which already are powerful enough to be on that balance of in that balance of power, and puts everyone else really on the sidelines.
Right. So it's about time that we bring out the maps. But one thing with the Congress of Vienna, another thing, because there's so much to say about it as it relates to the Pax Britannia and helping the British maintain their power and keeping certain stability within Europe. And we'll talk more about that. But an aspect of the Congress of Vienna that is important is that while the 25 years of conflict with France, revolutionary France, and with eventually Napoleonic France, is that it was a major European team up effort, a continent that is known for so much violence and so much ethnic strife and so much religious conflict. It was an effort unlike even the times in where all of Europe would be fighting France at once, multiple times throughout those 25-year time period, in where the entire continent decided that we are going to team up. But again, like central to human nature, something that we had to talk about a lot in the Far Left Equals Far Right final episode. And then the Peace v. Freedom, where we said that, great, you can have a lot of people team up, but against who? And we would eventually find that team up against liberals, and they'd be teaming up against what they saw as potential revolutionaries. So really the peace settlement in 1815 um, was about teaming up for the sake of European security rather than the security of their own individual state. They needed to not act in their own interest, so that the next state across from them would be able to stay strong enough to fight the insurgents within their country. So a major European team up effort. So as we see right here with this map, this is what Europe looked like during, I believe, 1812.
Yep.
The very midst of Napoleonic conquest. So there are, as you can see here, France, their borders in the key, as you can see with the colors, is quite a bit beyond where their modern borders are. You see them go into the Low Countries, Netherlands and Belgium and modern day Luxembourg and those countries over there, as well as they have a lot of territory within Europe, within Italy, around the Alps, as you can see with the Principality of Lucca, which is now known as Piedmont. And then you have the Papal States nearby Rome, which, as you can see here, is at this time under direct French control. You have the Dalmatian coast on the other side of the Adriatic that was formerly under Austrian control, that is now under French control, as well as Corsica, which even now today is French. But as you can see, looking at the wider picture of Europe, France has a lot more power than, for the sake of continental stability, it's due to have. So for the sake of European security, France is way too powerful. And this isn't the first time in European history in where a single state would be too powerful. Germany was getting way too powerful in the lead up to World War II. But as you can see right here, moving away from that sidetrack, France has way too much power. So anything you want to add to that, Chad, before we get on to the next map?
No, I think that's about it. I mean, you really emphasized that what you had here was an Avengers level threat, and that threat was the liberal forces of France. And as we talked about in the last kind of episodes, it wasn't here we discussed the geographic threat of France expanding, but again, it was also that ideological threat, that idea of rights, individual freedoms that have spread to all across Europe. Every empire would be in danger. And so not only was Europe looking to, secure stability simply by, geographic standards and military standards, but it wanted a stability away from liberalism, a stability that kept things somewhat in the status quo, in that kings could keep their power, the Pope could keep their power, and none of these pesky peasants thinking that they have any value.
Right. So as we move into the next photo, that was before the Congress of Vienna settlement. That was before Napoleon was finally defeated with the March on Paris and then eventually with Waterloo. This is what Europe would look like after the Congress of Vienna, after a fierce, vicious negotiations between states, the winners, including even France itself, so that no nation felt the inclination to fight one over the other. So one of the main aims of the Congress of Vienna was to contain France. As much as France was to be part of these negotiations, France, there was still an interest to make sure that they weren't too powerful. So England wanted a strong Netherlands. That's why you can see here that there is a unified Netherlands state that would be near the French border with access to the English Channel to prevent French expansion. Because as we compare with the last photo, France was able to expand all the way up into modern day northern Germany because of their dominance in that region. So to be able to create a state that would block off that expansion, that would be good. Because before then, before 1789, before the French Revolution, that territory used to be under Habsburg Austrian control. But now that it had its own separate independent identity, that it would be able to defend itself as a first priority against any possible French aggression. Another aspect of French containment was that Austria wanted to keep Italy out of French influence, that it would keep France locked within its geographical frontiers, with its border on the English Channel, border on the Atlantic, on its north and west, and the Atlantic on the south, the Rhine River on its eastern frontier, but then also to stop from expansion into the Alps region in the southeast. Comparing to the last map, France had a lot of hegemony in Italy, and for the sake of the Austrian Empire, it was really important that they did not have that entrance route. So, if there was a way that Austria or anyone could exert a certain amount of authority to prevent French expansion if they were to be stupid enough to invade Italy, then that would also be in the interests of European security. Um, and as we move into the second aspect of the Congress of Vienna, protecting Central Europe, we have to address Metternich, again, Prince Metternich, Prince Clemens von Metternich. He would be a very important man during this time, and he was one of the main negotiators that would have a really big impact in coming up with ideas that would appease other foreign ministers of the major powers within Europe at the time to come to the agreements that would eventually be brought up. Um, and Metternich's worst fear, as someone who experienced the violence of the Napoleonic Wars, was quote, in Metternich's case, coming to terms with the war meant considering the suffering he had witnessed endless times on the battlefield and along the roads unnecessary, pointless, even a crime caused by human delusions of grandeur that he thought could pull down the walls protecting civilization and the law as he understood it at any time in any place. It was the duty of politics to erect enduring barriers against this possibility. He opposed this catastrophe on humanitarian grounds, and his lasting commitment was never again. End quote. So this is from Wolfram Siemens, Metternich, strategist and visionary. So a work by a historian analyzing the events of the time and the intentions of this man, because this man, he would eventually be he would be seen as this enemy to liberty in the times after the Congress of Vienna, post 1815 until 1848. But his intention at the time in creating this peace and coming up with the ideas that other foreign ministers would agree with for continental peace, they really were at the time quite noble, because again, 5 to 10 million people died under the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon was seen as a madman that wanted to conquer Europe entirely. He would just keep fighting and fighting and fighting until France had control over the entire continent and maybe even the whole world. So if there was a block against that kind of aggression for which Metternich really wanted, he, as Wolfram Seaman puts it, he saw it as more of a humanitarian act to do what he would do in this conference.
Yeah, and this brings us into an important point on, well, another point on why liberalism and why the Congress of Vienna sought to do what it did against, the state of France, and of course the idea of liberalism itself, because these leaders they feared that another war like more wars like the Napoleonic Wars would strike Europe again. And as we just said, the Wars were extremely brutal and were very, very recent in the minds of these leaders, giving them an imperative to come do a deal, to create a situation, a construct or something of the sort that could keep Europe peaceful. These leaders saw that any conflict that could be just as bad as this one would be devastating, not only to just the people of the European continent, but also to their own power. And so that's why in this context, the fight against liberalism, the fight against France of, the expansion and the addition of nations and people's power was seen as a good thing, because all that liberalism at the time was really seen was as something that led France to become as violent and aggressive and led to a large war, which led to millions of people dying. Within that context, you can understand where there's not much other when there's not much other examples that liberalism can be seen as a threat, not only again to just the elites in power in Europe, but also to this just the simple stability of Europe. So that it brings a really important context that's needed of why the fight against liberalism was something more than just an ideological one. It was one led on humanitarian grounds. So at the time, leaders and people throughout Europe could see this fight against liberalism as something noble, because how could you say that stopping war is bad in this case, in this when it's something as recent and probably, took your brother
Right.
in context.
I mean, like saying that you want peace is always going to sway people. And at this time, unlike a lot of other times in history, and definitely for the people at the time, it was a time in where that argument was a very strong one. Nobody wanted to go back to war. People wanted to act in their own nation's interest. They wanted to do what was good for their state, but no one wanted to go to war over it. They already saw what war could do. Um, and like peace is always a very good, convincing argument, especially after this much conflict. I remember I'm catching up with my dad right now on during spring break right now, watching some of the Star Wars Bad Batch series. And don't want to go too long about it, but I remember like I'm watching it right now, and they consistently are saying, because the Bad Batch is based right after this long war in Star Wars chronology called the Clone Wars throughout the whole galaxy. And as the Empire, which is established right after the war, is consolidating its control, they're consistently saying, we want peace. Don't revolt against us. We want peace. You can trust us. We want peace. Why would you not want peace? So as you can see right here at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there is this conservative order which is about to rain down on the people harder than they could ever expect. And we'll go further into that in the next episode. But the intentions of the people writing these treaties is quite noble. They want peace. And because again, something you need to keep in mind, Metternich is in his early 40s at this time. And, he's not exactly a teenager. He's not crazy young, but this war had gone on for a quarter of a century. When the French revolted against their king and their queen, he was 15 years old. And as the continent of Europe rose up against France, and France fought them back time and time again, and as Napoleon grew in power, he grew from his teens to his 20s to his 30s, and now finally, as he's 41, 42 years old, he's writing the treaty that would end it. So like it's actually crazy to think about just how much like this conflict has shaped the lives of the people, even like even counts and nobles like Metternich is. This time in European history has had a really great impact on his own life. So of course you're going to have the intention of bringing peace.
Yeah, that's a great point. Can always count on Khalil for a Star Wars reference. So, as we get back into our ideas about the balance of power, so you know how I mentioned earlier that with the balance of power, it's basically the larger nations who are already stable enough will have some of the sway, and those smaller countries kind of get cast to the side. Well, what if I told you that there was one of those smaller countries, or at least a country that hadn't been considered in a lot of this, that was rising to power and was coming into a position that could upset this balance? And so in this case, it was the Russian Empire, or what would be the Russian Empire. So after the Napoleonic Wars, Russia was in a position throughout the continent of Europe. And Khalil, if you want to bring up a map, you can, but it was in a position on the continent that could disrupt the balance of power that Europe in the Congress of Vienna was, trying to formulate. So It had its military capacity was very high, large army, and it had troops very far west from its, internal territory of its borders. And of course, due to their involvement in the Napoleonic Wars. And along with that, we had the young and aggressive and also sometimes seen as uncompromising Tsar Alexander I representing Russia at the Conference of Vienna and was making and who made the threat that in the eyes of many diplomats needed to be checked. And again, this brings up the issue of what happens when one of those countries that's seen as less important, not really, a power that needs to be balanced with the big boys who are up to bat. What happens when they do have that power, when they do have that influence, and when, if they would like to make a new threat and would like to expand upon the territories that they had, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, perfect. So you have Russians in Poland, you have them in that's not in Poland. You have Russia, you have Poland, you have Prussia. We had Russian troops all the way throughout Europe that were, sometimes in sparsely manners, but in lands that they had regained during the Napoleonic Wars. So you had an empire that was growing, an empire that during again, that aided in the conflict and wanted to make a bigger stake for itself. So what happens when a nation like this wants to potentially upset the balance of power? Um, and I'll let you go off with this, Khalil. But basically, this is setting the stage for as the balance of power, starts as it starts to form, it does also start to have its crises.
Right. Because Russia, at least when we look at Europe, like with Asia, it's a little more complicated, but they're kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about right now. But with Europe, as you can see, yeah, there is a very much a Western point into Europe. And this map is interesting because the purple sections right here in Saxony and Warsaw, as they call it right here, this is that's to show that as of the time of when the Congress of Vienna was happening, and as like the treaties were being negotiated, this is where Russian troops were being occupied during their reconquest against Napoleon, and as they fought with the other European powers against Napoleon. Like at the end of the war, this is where Russian troops still were by the time that it was over. Like the troops hadn't necessarily been brought back into their borders because the borders were still being negotiated. And also for the interests of making sure that there were no Napoleonic guerrilla groups or anything, it's important to keep occupying forces within a state even once you've defeated it for a certain amount of time. So, as you can see right here, the edges of Warsaw, which is called the Duchy of Warsaw, it was a rump state that was agreed upon between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander during the Napoleonic Wars, as there was a certain time when they were allied. But at the end of this war, and Napoleon is gone, exiled, Tsar Alexander, after the hundreds of thousands of people that he lost during Napoleon's invasion, not just troops, but also a lot of peasants. He is telling his nobles at home, I will gain more territory to make up for the loss that we've had during this war. And he's appealing to retake over this territory in modern day Poland, which, as you could see, would bring him very close to the heart of Europe. You know, right now we think a lot about Russian aggression, but imagine if Russia had borders all the way up until like middle of Germany right here. That's crazy. That's actually crazy that Russia would be that far west into Europe. So there was a big fight between the foreign ministers of the Austrian Empire and Prussia and France and England to discuss whether or not Russia should have this extra territory. Because for the sake of balance of power, you have to think, well, each individual great power of of Europe needs to be strong enough to defend against aggression. Let's say, possibly, Russia wanted to invade Prussia. They'd win, hands down. And as you can see from this map right here, if Russia were to not evacuate from these places that they have currently occupied, Russia's over. And with Austria, it's a little more arguable. They do have a lot of troops that like left over from the end of the war. It'd be a harder fight, but like that is the very we're looking at the very foundational parts of the of balance of power right here. Each individual major state needs to be strong enough to defend against possible aggression. Ideally, the other nations of Europe and the bigger states would aid Prussia if Russia were to invade it, but Prussia by itself is clearly not strong enough to defend itself. So Tsar Alexander, what he's asking for would jeopardize the peace of Europe. And there's a lot of fights. There's a lot of fights about whether or not Russia needs this territory. Tsar Alexander claims that if he doesn't gain territory to make up for the aggression against him by Napoleon, that nobles will overthrow him at home. So there's a lot of fights, a lot of counter arguments, and a lot of discussions over whether or not Russia deserves this territory. And that also means making up a bunch of a lot of deals have to be made in the heart of Germany of territories that Prussia would gain, so that it had enough territorial integrity, maybe a fallback line that it would have in the case of aggression from Russia, as well as even handing over that territory of Warsaw over to Russia. Um, um, okay, good, because this is hard to explain here. Let's see. So there would be, when you look at Central Europe, Russia was given the Duchy of Warsaw, which was renamed the Kingdom of Poland. And the idea was that it would be its own independent state, that the Tsar Alexander would have his own separate title as King of Poland, on top of his title of Emperor of Russia. And it would have its own constitution. It would be a constitutional monarchy, and Tsar Alexander would have limited powers within Poland. Now, eventually, in the 10 years after the Congress of Vienna, Tsar Alexander would slowly chip away at this liberal foundation of Poland to the point when he died in 1825, Poland was just considered to be annexed by Russia, but it had a liberal spirit within that territory. And Poles, they would argue for their own state for 100 years until they eventually got it after World War One. And so the Metternich and the other foreign ministers of Europe decided, you know what, just give Alexander Poland. But even though that gives him a bit of a power crutch in Europe, those liberals within Poland will give him a hard enough of time to where he'll second guess continuing to advance west into Europe. And then with Prussia, as I was saying, they received some territory in Germany, as you can see a little bit on their on the western section. But there would be this new political entity called the German Confederation between like two kind of ruling powers helping to govern it, the Austrian Empire and Prussia. And between the two of them, this new political organization, it would give the capacity for self-defense for each one of these small German states that still exist after the Congress of Vienna, to, if they're invaded by anyone within the Confederation or any non-German state like France, then all the other members within the Confederation would jump to their defense, including Prussia and Austria. So this German Confederation would be kind of like the first step to eventual German unification. But for the sake of European security, a unified Germany was not in consideration yet at this time, because who would unify it? Would it be Prussia and they would get too much power enough that they might consider invading someone else? Or Austria, who already has so much territory? Certainly it wasn't going to be France because they're not even German. And Russia, well, of course, if they were allowed to go that far into Europe, then they would be their own threat in of themselves. And so this political entity, the German Confederation, was the greatest compromise for keeping a certain protection within Central Europe. So it's complicated, but really that was the biggest problems within the Congress of Vienna that needed to be solved of what to do with Germany, because there was the thousand-year-old Holy Roman Empire that existed, founded by Charlemagne, that we talked about with the Catholic episodes, that Napoleon effectively dissolved in 1805 after brutally defeating the coalition forces of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Um, and with that Holy Roman Empire being gone, there needed to be a new political entity that would keep Germany safe. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What's so interesting about this whole, I guess, episode of history is what it means for the idea of nations. Because as of now, 1815, um, we had the Reformation of nations, we had the opposing of liberalism, and what the balance of power does, what this restructuring and basically creating of nations, of states more so, the nations, was the idea of that these states are really their entire purpose is to be a buffer. I mean, we had when it came to the threat, the threat of Russia, we had the idea of one to give Poland to Russia just as a level of appeasement, but you had the idea of the creation of states, the creation of that German federation to be more so as a buffer, as to serve a purpose for the rest of Europe, to serve a purpose for European stability, um, rather than the liberal notions of peoples wanting to form a nation, for their own ideals. Of course, looking back at this now, that an idea of a state, of the people for the people of right is right to us. But in the context of this situation, this idea of balance of power, what it did was delegate to nations who, you know, say didn't exist or weren't as part of this balance of power than others, is that their entire existence was really uh, boiled down into their geopolitical significance. How important was it that there be a buffer zone um, between Russia and the Western European states, of France and possibly all the way to Britain? How important was it that um, the lands themselves, who would rule over this German Confederation, that wasn't up for debate and discussion at the time yet. You just needed some land that would serve as a buffer. And so what just strikes me as really interesting, as we kind of get towards the end of this part, um, of looking at the Pax Britannia as we continue along with this evolution and how it kept the peace, was how the balance of power really delegated, how it defined the existence of nations is more so to their usefulness and how well that they fit into, the puzzle of European stability, which at the end of the day was the biggest, um, it was the biggest motivator for the leaders of what's it called? For the leaders of Europe. So
Right.
we do have, yeah.
Yeah, like there's some things that like if we like because a lot of what I said right there it was just kind of like off of my own memory of the events, but really to kind of summarize, um the Tsar Alexander was seen as a major threat to European peace because of his uncompromising position on Poland. So much so that Lord Castlereagh, the British foreign minister, he wrote to the prime minister in London that unless the Emperor of Russia can be brought to a more moderate and sound course of public conduct, the peace which we have so clearly purchased will be of a short duration. You must make up your mind to watch him and resist him if necessary as another Bonaparte. So he was seen as a major threat to European peace. So much so that when Alexander laid out his plan on Poland, Austria, and Prussia, because of where Poland sat in between Prussia as it existed at the time and Austria, they became suddenly aware of the power that they had given to Russia in the fight against Napoleon. When earlier the Austrians and Prussians allowed Russian troops within their territory to maintain the momentum of their advances against Napoleon's defeated army, because as Napoleon's troops were retreating very quickly out of Russia during that very cold winter, Russia asked their allies, Prussia and Austria, can we bring our troops in here to push the initiative? And they said yes. And so when they allowed them at that time to continue to push Napoleon's forces, they realized that they what they could not in war, and that was that Alexander was young, he was ambitious, but also incredibly opportunistic. He saw that his armies had been allowed to advance over 1,000 miles west into Europe, so much so that he actually Russia, they had occupied territories not just within Germany, but also, believe me or not, within France itself, as France was being occupied by the other alliance powers. And so he noticed that he could take advantage of the opportunity to press his claim over Poland as a physical display of victory to, again, as I mentioned, to justify his losses. And so he advocated to the Congress for an installment. Okay, well, to skip that, basically, there were a lot of to summarize, everything. Tsar Alexander was seen as a potential Bonaparte, and so suddenly it raised the alarms of a lot of major powers within Europe to just suddenly um, send ultimatums to him, and they basically what they had to do at the end was say that all of Europe would fight Russia if they if Alexander didn't stop pressing his claims further beyond Poland, which he wanted to do. And this is really the fruits of the labor that came from these negotiations. And so that's why you see the map as it is by 1815, which largely stayed the same way largely until 1914, with, of course, some changes in the map in Italy and Germany with some nationalist movements. And so, again, not any one nation can become too powerful. And with Russia, that was very much a threat at the time. And with very good politicking and the threat of force, which is so important to balance of power politics, they were able to finally come to that peace.
Yeah, exactly. So the situation with Russia after or during and after the Congress of Vienna really illuminated the reality of the balance of power. Every nation had to be, every state more so, had to be at an equal level of footing in that aggression from one side to another could be countered and essentially disincentivized through say the casualties that they would face or the difficulties that any conflict would prove to either of them. So again, just like that point before, it delegated nations down. It melted nations down really down to their utility, to their use in this framework of the balance of power. The big guys had their say, and the smaller nations who weren't seen as most important were kind of left to the side, or their rights or territorial, claims more so disregarded. But Russia again proved problematic for this. Um, but what the Congress of Vienna did and what came out of 1815 in that map, as we just recently shown, is that Britain or the forces of Britain really emerged victorious out of this whole process. Its idea of a balance of power, um, of maintaining stability, which more so meant, which in this context meant the weakness of France and the weakness of eventually Russia, those goals were accomplished. And so the conservative model really that Britain would use, it helped Britain stay kind of the most. It helped Britain keep some focus with Europe and also focus with its colonies. Um, in addition to securing a kind of buffer against the ideas of liberalism, and it's what the Congress of Vienna did again was continue that fight against liberalism and helped to a certain extent by it helped that fight against the spreading of liberalism for the time. And so we have another quote from a book, The Age of Revolution by Eric Hobsbawm, that says, quote, Britain had, by 1815, gained the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world, having emerged from 20 years of war against France as the only industrialized economy, the only naval power, and virtually the only colonial power of the world, end quote. And again, so what we have is what is realized by Britain through its idea of this balance of power of the most powerful nations stay, at the levels that they are. They're the ones who kind of they come out of this as winners. They're able to keep Europe safe, keep Europe stable, in that there won't be many threats to Britain's colonies, to its territorial integrity, to its economic success. And since the colonies really weren't involved in Europe, they were all throughout the world, in Africa and you know Asia, all those kind of places. Since those colonies weren't involved in these kind of disputes, Britain wouldn't have to worry about, say, France or Russia getting into its business. And so, with these negotiations, with this idea of the balance of power that would hopefully keep the European states in peace, Britain came out with a pretty big win.
Right. I mean, since again, these colonies weren't in Europe and Britain had so much of an intention of staying out of European politics, they really did not want to muddy themselves up with treaties or with negotiations with other countries and these non-aggression pacts. They wanted to stay out of that entirely, and that's what would be called splendid isolation. Britain did not want at any time to be involved in almost being part of a war. They wanted to stay out of it entirely. They would kind of be this trump card that would be used to stop war on the continent, but they did not want to be wrapped up into that entirely. And so they could walk away with clear hegemony. They would have, again, as Hobsbawm said, the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world. Um, and it would be completely okay because they had no intention of pressing that power onto Europe, unlike the other European states, because it was an island, and again, its influence was outside of Europe, not affecting much of its policies in Europe. And so um, that's really the tie-in between this event, the Congress of Vienna, and Britain's global power. And so the Congress of Vienna is a really complicated thing to learn about, just like the 30 Years' War. As you go into the details, is a really hard thing to learn about. There's a lot of times in history, some moments in history, where if you go into the details and even if you try to look at it through a certain point of view and only use pieces of it, it's exhausting. And we did whatever we could, but there might still be questions. But if you have them, you could just put it in the comments. And as we go forward into this next episode, another reminder from what we did a few months ago with our first episodes. Just like, subscribe, and keep coming back for more episodes, because this is just a really fun thing that we like to do. But we don't mind the support. So if there's anything else you want to add, Chad.
That's about it. Yeah. Um,
Right. Well, without a further ado, I'm Khalil,
I'm Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth.
We'll see you in the next one.